James sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his heart pounding like a war drum. The tiny vial containing his baby's DNA sample rested on the desk beside him. It wasn't supposed to come to this. 3 years of marriage, countless moments of love, arguments, and shared dreams. How could it all boil down to this single test? Yet the doubt gnawed at him. Emma, his wife, had always been radiant, a woman who could light up any room. But over the past few months, there had been something unsettling in her behavior. She was distant, her smiles no longer reached her eyes, and the once unshakable bond between them felt frayed. At first, James brushed it off as stress from her pregnancy, but then came the whispers, subtle, cruel hints from neighbors, friends, and even his own mind. "I'm telling you, James," his best friend Kyle had warned over beers one night. "Something doesn't add up. I've seen the way your dad looks at her. It's unsettling." James laughed it off at the time, dismissing it as a tasteless joke. But the idea took root, festering in the darkest corners of his thoughts. When their son, Ethan, was born, James felt an instant connection, yet an unfamiliar shadow loomed. Ethan's features, his hair, his eyes seemed too familiar, but not in the way James had expected. It wasn't his own reflection he saw in the boy, but someone else's, someone too close for comfort. Unable to suppress his doubts any longer, James had taken the leap that no husband ever wants to take. He'd ordered a DNA test. As the results sat unread in his inbox, a cold fear gripped him. What if the whispers were true? What if his father, his own blood, was responsible for the unthinkable? Summoning every ounce of courage, James opened the email and read the first line. His world crumbled. James stared at the screen, his vision blurring as the words burned into his mind. The probability of paternity is 0%. It felt like time had stopped, the air around him suffocating. His father, the man who had raised him, taught him how to ride a bike, and stood beside him on his wedding day, was the real father of his child. A surge of emotions coursed through him: anger, betrayal, humiliation. He clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. How could Emma do this to him? How could he do this to him? The thought of their secret moments, the stolen glances, the lies whispered in the dark, made his stomach churn. James slammed his laptop shut and stormed out of the room, his heart racing as his mind spiraled into chaos. Emma was in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. He stood silently watching her, trying to make sense of how the woman he once loved more than life itself could betray him in the worst possible way. "James?" Emma's voice broke through his thoughts as she turned to face him. Her smile faded when she saw the expression on his face. "What's wrong?" James took a deep breath, his chest heaving with suppressed rage. "I did the test," he said, his voice low and trembling. Emma's eyes widened and the knife slipped from her hand, clattering against the countertop. "What test?" she stammered, but the guilt written all over her face told him she already knew. "The DNA test," he said, his voice rising. "Ethan isn't mine, Emma. He's his." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she shook her head, her lips trembling. "James, please. Let me explain." "Explain what?" he snapped, taking a step closer. "That you've been sleeping with my father? That the child I've been raising as my own is actually his? What kind of explanation could possibly make this okay?" Emma's knees buckled and she sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was lonely, James. You were always working, always too busy for me. And he was there. He listened. He cared. I made a terrible mistake." James felt as if the ground beneath him had been ripped away. The woman he loved, the mother of his child, was confessing to the ultimate betrayal, and his father, the man he trusted more than anyone, had been complicit. The weight of their deceit was crushing, and James had no idea how to move forward. James felt his breath hitch as Emma's words echoed in his ears. He was there. The betrayal wasn't just a knife in his back, it was a dagger straight to his soul. He turned away from her, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, his fists clenching and unclenching, as he struggled to contain his fury. "You didn't mean for this to happen," James spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You didn't mean to destroy our marriage. You didn't mean to break me. Do you even hear yourself, Emma?" Emma's sobs grew louder, but James didn't care. He had no sympathy left to give. The love they had once shared felt like a cruel joke, a fabrication designed to blind him to the truth. But then a new thought pierced his mind. His father, the man who had sat across from him at countless family dinners, who had offered him fatherly advice and toasted to his happiness at his wedding. How long had he been hiding this monstrous secret? Without a word, James stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Emma crumpled on the floor. His destination was clear, his parents' house. Every step he took felt heavier, his emotions shifting from despair to pure, unfiltered rage. When he arrived, James didn't bother knocking. He flung the door open, startling his father, Richard, who was lounging in the living room, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper, as if his world hadn't just imploded. "James," Richard said, setting the mug down. "What's going on, son?" James's laugh was cold and hollow, devoid of any humor. "Don't you dare call me that," he snarled. "You lost the right to call me your son the moment you slept with my wife." Richard's face paled, and for a brief moment, he seemed frozen in place. But then he recovered, his expression shifting to one of denial. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice firm but unconvincing. James stepped closer, towering over his father. "Don't lie to me, Richard. The DNA test doesn't lie. Ethan is yours. How could you do this to me? To us?" Richard sighed heavily, the facade of innocence crumbling under the weight of his son's fury. "James, I didn't mean for things to get this far. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" James roared, cutting him off. "You call destroying your own family a mistake? You're a coward, Richard, a selfish, disgusting coward." Richard's eyes glistened, but James didn't care if his father felt guilty. He wanted answers, accountability, anything to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed his life. "Was I not enough for you?" James demanded, his voice cracking. "Did you have to take everything from me? My wife? My son? My trust?" Richard hung his head, unable to meet James's piercing gaze. "I have no excuse," he whispered. "I was weak. I've regretted it every day since, but I didn't know how to make it right." James's chest heaved as he fought back tears of his own. His entire world had been shattered, and the people he thought he could trust most had been the ones to destroy it. "Save your regrets," James said bitterly. "They mean nothing to me now." With that, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed in the silence, a grim punctuation to the nightmare that had become his reality. James drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring through the windshield as tears stung his eyes. His mind was a chaotic storm, replaying the betrayal over and over. The people he trusted most had ripped his life apart, leaving him in a hollow shell of what once was. Every time he thought about Ethan, his son, or at least the boy he had believed was his, the pain became unbearable. Finally, he pulled into an empty parking lot and killed the engine. The silence was deafening, amplifying the torment within him. For the first time since the truth unraveled, James allowed himself to feel everything: anger, sorrow, confusion. It all came crashing down, and he screamed into the void, his voice raw and broken. As the echoes faded, James's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it at first, but when it buzzed again, he pulled it out and saw Emma's name on the screen. His instinct was to toss the phone out the window, but a strange compulsion stopped him. Instead, he answered, his voice cold and distant. "What do you want?" Emma's voice was shaky, her guilt palpable through the line. "James, please come home. We need to talk about this." "About Ethan?" James let out a bitter laugh. "Talk? You want to talk? After everything you've done, you think words can fix this?" "Please," Emma begged, her voice breaking. "Whatever happens between us, Ethan is innocent in all of this. He needs you, James. He loves you." The mention of Ethan hit James like a punch to the gut. Despite the truth of his parentage, the boy had always seen him as a father. He'd been there for Ethan's first steps, his first words, every scraped knee and bedtime story. None of that was a lie. "I'll come home," James said finally, his voice laced with exhaustion. "But don't expect me to forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Emma sobbed softly on the other end. "Thank you." When James walked through the front door, Ethan was the first to greet him, running toward him with open arms. "Daddy," the boy squealed, his face lighting up with pure joy. James froze, his heart caught in a painful tug-of-war between love and betrayal. He knelt down and hugged Ethan tightly, tears streaming down his face. As James held the boy, Emma stood in the doorway, watching with a mixture of hope and regret. She wanted to speak, to explain herself further, but she knew this wasn't the time. James gently pulled away from Ethan and looked at her, his eyes filled with unspoken pain. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "But things will never be the same again." Emma nodded, her expression solemn. She knew she had shattered their lives, and whatever came next would be on James's terms. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act, a fragile attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Ethan's sake. James avoided Emma as much as possible, his interactions with her limited to curt, emotionless exchanges. His nights were spent on the couch, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events in his mind. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when the truth haunted him so relentlessly. Ethan remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil around him. For James, the boy's laughter was both a source of comfort and a cruel reminder of the betrayal. He loved Ethan fiercely, but every time he looked at him, he saw Richard's face staring back. One evening, James received an unexpected call from his mother, Margaret. He hesitated before answering, unsure of how much she knew about the situation. "James," Margaret began, her voice heavy with concern, "your father told me everything." James's grip on the phone tightened. "And what do you want me to do about it?" "I'm not calling to defend him," she said quickly. "I'm calling because I want you to know that I had no idea. If I had, I would have stopped it. I'm just as disgusted as you are." James's anger softened slightly, though the pain remained. "Then why are you still with him, Mom? How can you stay with someone who's capable of this?" Margaret's voice faltered. "I don't know, James. I've spent my entire life with him. Walking away feels impossible. But maybe I should have left a long time ago." For the first time, James realized his mother was a victim in all of this too. She had been blindsided, just as he had, by the man they both trusted. "What do I do, Mom?" James asked, his voice breaking. "How do I move forward from this?" Margaret was silent for a moment before replying, "You do what's best for Ethan. He didn't ask for any of this, James. He needs stability, love, and a father who cares for him. You've always been that man, and no DNA test can change that." Her words struck a chord in James's heart. Ethan was innocent in all of this, and his love for the boy was real, unchanged by the truth of his parentage. "Thanks, Mom," James said quietly. As he hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Ethan's happiness had to come first, no matter how broken he felt inside. Weeks passed, and though the pain still lingered, James found himself taking small steps toward rebuilding his life. He focused on Ethan, pouring every ounce of his energy into being the father the boy deserved. They spent afternoons at the park, built forts in the living room, and read bedtime stories together. For those moments, James could almost forget the betrayal. Almost. But the tension with Emma remained unresolved. She tried to apologize, to explain herself, but James couldn't bring himself to engage. He had buried his anger deep, unsure if forgiveness was even possible. One evening, as James was tucking Ethan into bed, the boy looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy, why don't you smile anymore?" The question hit James like a freight train. He forced a small smile and ruffled Ethan's hair. "I'm just tired, buddy. Don't worry about me." But as James left the room, he knew he couldn't keep living in limbo. For Ethan's sake, and for his own, he needed closure. The next day, James asked Emma to sit down with him. She looked nervous but hopeful, her hands fidgeting in her lap as she waited for him to speak. "I need answers," James said bluntly. "No more excuses, no more half-truths. I need to know why this happened." Emma nodded, tears already welling in her eyes. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. "Start with why," James said, his voice firm. Emma took a deep breath. "I felt invisible, James. You were always working, always distracted. I tried to talk to you, but you didn't hear me. And then, Richard was there. He listened to me, paid attention to me. It was wrong, and I hate myself for it. But I felt seen for the first time in years. James's jaw tightened. And that justifies what you did? No, Emma said quickly. Nothing justifies it. I betrayed you, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I need you to know that it wasn't because I didn't love you. I was lost, and I made a terrible mistake. James leaned back in his chair, his emotions a tangled mess. He wanted to scream, to cry, to walk away and never look back. But he also wanted to find a way forward, for Ethan, if not for himself. Things will never be the same between us, James said finally. But for Ethan's sake, I'm willing to try. Not for us, but for him. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, James. I promise. As James stood and walked away, he felt a strange sense of relief. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time since the truth came out, he felt like he could breathe again. In the weeks that followed, James focused on creating a new normal. He sought therapy to process his emotions, slowly began to mend his relationship with Emma, and most importantly, continued to be the father Ethan needed. The scars of betrayal would never fully heal, but James was determined to move forward, not for himself, but for the boy who still called him Daddy.